Okay, so the poem that I'm going to be talking you through today is Dulce et Decorum Est by Wilfred Owen. Now, Wilfred Owen is one of the most infamous World War I poets of all times, and his work is still applauded and greatly celebrated today. But I think what's particularly tragic about Owen's life is the fact that he served in World War I, so 1914 to 1918, but sadly a week before Armistice Day in November 1918, he actually died in combat. So during Owen's own experiences of war, he was able to capture and record lots of his emotions about the trauma and the conflict that he and his comrades faced in those awful conditions in the trenches. Now, I've already spoken before about one of my strategies with poetry is to always think about, first of all, what I notice about what I'm reading, and second of all, what I wonder. Now, it's the questions that and the phrases that we're wondering about that we're going to be able to analyse the most, because those are going to be the interesting parts, because they'll be forcing us to question, well, why do we think the writer or the poet has done that? So hopefully at this point you would have read through the poem yourself, and it's really important as well just to be able to gain a sense of understanding of what's actually going on in this poem. So this is specifically talking about how exhausted and how downbeat the soldiers are during their experience of war. And you can see that here with bent double like old beggars under sacks. So they are entirely sort of brought down by their experiences of war. They're being compared to being like beggars, like hags that are trudging through, marching through, almost as if they were asleep because they're just so exhausted from war. But then as we move into the second stanza here, you can see the introduction of the gas. So we can see gas, gas, quick boys, an ecstasy of fumbling, fitting the clumsy helmets just in time. So there's obviously a gas explosion. And something to say about that gas explosion is that one of the strategies of warfare was revolved around something called mustard gas. Now, whilst it perhaps wasn't as poisonous immediately as some other gases such as chlorine at the time, it was a gas that kind of lingered in the air for days and would lead to you developing blisters over your body. It would lead to vomiting, as well as internal and external bleeding. So a really sort of grotesque, gruesome way to die, really. And it would take as long as 5 weeks to die from this. So an excruciating, painful experience. And essentially the soldiers here have heard there is this gas explosion, and one of them, who is just in a complete daze, is unable to put his clumsy helmet on just in time. Whereas, as we can see, the speaker or the persona of the poem is managing to do that and kind of sees the world through the misty panes and the thick green light. So he's kind of suggesting that it's like he's under a green sea as he sees this man choking and spluttering in front of him. But even though he's seen this experience, in this sort of fragmented stanza, which clearly stands out compared to the rest of the poem, we see that the speaker of the poem is really struggling to understand the experiences that he's just seen. Now, this kind of comes back to a key concept which wouldn't have been acknowledged then, but is certainly understood more so today, called PTSD, which is post-traumatic stress disorder. So it's almost like whilst he's seen this experience, the image of that person effectively drowning in the gas is still haunting this individual, even in his dreams, which, as I've underlined there, we've got this triplet of guttering, choking, and drowning. And as we move to the final stanza of the poem, we get this sense of claustrophobia. We've got this sensory imagery of the froth-corrupted lungs, the cancer, the devil sick. So a really sort of gruesome, gutsy end to this poem. And then the huge irony here of, well, if you had experienced war like this, my friend, then you would not believe the old lie, Dulce et decorum est, pro patria mori. So essentially, the addressing here of my friend is specifically to another poet called Jessie Pope, and she wrote lots of poetry which was inspiring people to go to war and was seen to be a form of propaganda. Now, propaganda is when there is media in terms of imagery, in terms of videos, in terms of literature, art being produced to try and transfer a certain idea and to kind of get everyone rallying and on board with it. So essentially, Owen here is trying to attack the propaganda that is coming out at this time, because, you know, how is it a great thing to die for your country when this is the reality? So what's being addressed here is the old lie. So this key phrase, and also obviously the main title of the poem, is Latin, and it means it is right to die for one's country. Now, this phrase is actually inscribed on the walls of Sandhurst, which is the Royal Military Academy for the Army. So it's kind of this sort of glorified idea that the noble thing to do is to fight for your country and to die if needs be, and that you'll kind of go down in history as sacrificing your own life for the greater good, for the nation, essentially, which Owen is completely tearing apart and saying this is ridiculous. So the second approach that I've done, so I've thought about what I'm noticing in terms of the storyline, and I've highlighted some key ideas that I'm also wondering about. So bent double like old beggars under sacks. Now, I know here that this is a simile, and quite a lot of similes are used in this poem. So a simile, to remind you, is when you compare something to something else using like and as. So it's almost like the soldier here isn't really able to put into straightforward words exactly what they've been able to see. They can only understand this experience by comparing it to something else. And through doing that, it helps us as a reader who hasn't experienced what life is like on the battlefields or in the trenches to understand how awful the situation is. So the fact that they're being compared to beggars, you know, they're completely worn down. They're kind of half human here. They're not sort of the strong kind of physical military heroes that we might expect from posters and media campaigns of the time. Because the reality is that they're coughing, they're trudging along in the mud, which is getting everywhere. So if you notice as well the amount of verbs that have been used, so coughing, cursing, turning, trudging, marching, limping, all these verbs here are kind of painting a picture of a struggle. It's nothing in here is showing that this action in war is easy, and makes them seem even more weak and vulnerable to the effects of war. So therefore I've noticed those patterns in the verbs, and what I'm doing here is I'm wondering why that is being used. In addition, you might have remembered me talking about present participles. Now, present participle is essentially when the verb is within the form of having ing at the end. So it means that it is continuously going. So rather than coughed, you know, the soldiers coughed, that suggests that that moment has been and gone. But if they're continuing to cough through coughing, suggests that, you know, that experience of unpleasantness and pain is still very much being felt by the soldiers. I've also highlighted the first person pronoun plural we, because it shows this sense of a united sense that everybody is coming together and everyone is experiencing this. It's not just a personal personalised account, and everyone is feeling this horror. And the fact here that they're drunk with fatigue, it's like they are disorientated, they can't even walk in a straight line because they haven't slept for so long. Going back to this idea of the gas, we can see, and I'm noticing the exclamation marks, I'm noticing the dashes that have been used, which makes it feel disorientating. It makes it feel quite jarring. So what I mean by jarring is it just doesn't flow very well, because it's sort of moving from one thing to another, because it's showing how uncertain and ultimately how terrifying this moment is, as the gas is pouring into these people's lives. The word ecstasy, an ecstasy of fumbling fitting. Ecstasy is kind of a moment of sheer joy and elation, but it can also be a reference to a drug as well. So it's almost like they're drugged by the gas, but also it's kind of a real misunderstanding of their emotions as well. Like, you know, how can you prepare for this moment really, when really what they're doing is yelling out and stumbling? Notice again the verb choice, yelling, stumbling, present participles. So it's very much a continuous action that the speaker is still reliving even now. Same again with the use of similes here, obscenus, cancer. You've got the white eyes writhing in his face. It makes it very gruesome, very grotesque. And then finally, just considering why then we're left with this Latin saying. Well, it's no mistake by Owen that we have the title and both the final line of the poem making this quite a cyclical structure. So cyclical meaning you start with one idea and then you go back and repeat it by the end, to kind of really reveal how much of a lie this is.